Hi, everyone. Welcome to Miscarriage of Justice. Today, we're going to be talking about the Central Park 5 case. I provided you with a corresponding reading, so I'm pulling this information from that reading and from another couple articles that I will add supplementary for y'all to read if this interests you. So today, while we are going to be talking about the Central Park 5 case, we are also going to be focusing on some of the issues that we've discussed in the last few weeks, or the last 2 weeks. Because the Central Park 5, it really works as a reminder of the profound flaws that we see within the criminal justice system, not only highlighting kind of the devastating consequences of wrongful convictions, but also showing us the broader issues of racial bias, of media influence, of systemic failures, really, in law enforcement and judicial processes. So, before we get into the case, I do want to kind of briefly go over some of the things we talked about last week. So, we already know that there is racial bias in the criminal legal system. And there is a disproportionate amount of targeting, if you will, of Black and Brown people. So Black Americans are 5 times or 5.9 times more likely, actually, to be incarcerated than white Americans, right? It's a staggering difference when you think about it. And despite similar usage rates, Black people are 3.73 times more likely than white people to be arrested for marijuana possession, right? So that's evidence of unequal, what we call unequal enforcement. And in this case specifically, and we'll go back to the case in a second, we do have to talk a lot about racism and unconscious bias in policing and in judicial decisions. So these unconscious stereotypes that we all have matter much more when you are a police officer or you're a prosecutor or you're a judge, right? They have the potential to impact a person's life and their life trajectory in harrowing ways compared to an average person on the street, right? Um, Going back to the case, right? So, the case overview, if you are unfamiliar with this case, it happened on April 19th, 1989, and it happened in Central Park, uh, in New York City. The victim was Trisha Mealy. She was 28 years old. She was a white investment banker. And very briefly, trigger warning for rape and sexual assault. And I will do my best to treat this topic with the caution and honor it deserves. But it is, uncomfortable to talk about and to listen to. But yeah, she was brutally assaulted and raped while jogging through the park. Later that night, 5 teenagers were arrested and later convicted. The boys were Yusuf Salam, who was 15 years old, Kevin Richardson, who was 14 years old, Antron McCray, who was 15 years old, Raymond Santana, who was 14 years old, and Corey Wise, who was 16 years old. All were Black or Latino, and their convictions were based primarily on coerced confessions, and their sentences ranged from 5 to 15 years. Um, they were not exonerated until 2002, when the real perpetrator was finally brought to justice, Matthias Reyes, who was a convicted serial rapist. They used a DNA match, DNA evidence, and confession by him to convict him. And the outcome of that was all 5 sentences were vacated for these men now, um, who went into the criminal legal system as young boys. Um, and the media portrayal of these young boys was especially vicious and especially impactful in this case. So the media used words like wildling and wolf pack, which was pretty dehumanizing language. And they sold papers, right? But they also shaped how the public saw these young boys before they even stepped into a courtroom. And that unfortunately had massive influence on the jury selection process and eventually the trial outcome. So I mean, picture this: you're a prosecutor or you're a public defender, and you're picking a jury, and most potential jurors have already seen these headlines about the wildling wolf pack that is black and brown and assaulted a white woman. How do you even begin to find an unbiased jury in that situation, right? So it creates kind of this vicious cycle of media portrayal that affects public opinion, which in turn affects jury selection, which in turn affects trial outcomes, and who ends up suffering but the defendant, right? Um, and there are other factors at play here, right? So economic factors and representation. So access to quality legal representation. A lot of defendants cannot afford to get a, a private attorney, right? So a lot of folks rely on overworked public defenders, and that's not exactly a level playing field, right? We have a professor here at Rutgers, Valerio Bacek, who a few years ago conducted a study on public defenders to see how much time they had to review court cases before appearing in court. And I think, if I'm remembering correctly, the average time that a public defender had in New Jersey was 7 minutes to review a case before they were meant to show up in court. So imagine the prospect of facing years in prison and your lawyer has had barely enough time to look at your case. That's the reality for many poor defendants, who are unfortunately disproportionately people of color. And the bail system is also part of this, right? So it's another example of how race and class intersect in the criminal legal system. If you can't afford bail, you sit in jail, right? And Black men face 35% higher bail amounts than white men for similar cases. So it's like being punished twice: once for the alleged crime, so you're not even convicted yet, and once for being poor, right? Because you can't afford bail. Um, so, and this has like obviously long-term effects that we will get into in the coming weeks. But today I wanted to talk a bit about the interrogation techniques that were used within the courtroom. So the Reid technique was used. The parents weren't allowed into the room. The interrogation lasted for hours and hours and hours while these young boys were sleep deprived and were subjected to intense and grueling questions. They were provided with false promises about going home if they confessed. The interrogators really suffered from confirmation bias in this instance, from tunnel vision. We don't have a lot of recorded evidence of what happened in that interrogation room. And there were some cultural and linguistic barriers to consider, as well as inadequate training on false confessions, right? So, starting with the Reid technique, if you haven't heard of the Reid technique, that is a-okay. I only recently came to know what it is, right? And essentially, it's like a psychological chess game, right? Where the interrogator always wins. This technique is essentially designed to make you feel so hopeless that confessing seems like your best option. And if you're innocent, that's a recipe for wrongful conviction, right? And we see a higher susceptibility of juveniles and intellectually disabled individuals, a higher susceptibility of false confession, right? So think about being 14, being 15, and how easily peer pressure influenced you, right? Now multiply that by however much, and you're in front of a trained interrogator applying the pressure. It is a hard place to be in, right? And for someone with intellectual disabilities, these tactics can be even more confusing and intimidating. So it's like playing a game where you don't understand the rules. And in this instance, losing means going to prison. And we saw a lack of parental presence during these interrogations, right? So you're 15, you're scared out of your mind, you're facing tough questions from the police. Excuse me, I'm very caffeinated. Um, your parents are in many cases not allowed to be there, right? And it is a specific kind of irony in this situation because children are not allowed to be alone in a lot of spaces in the public sphere, right? There's a lot of expectations on how children need to act, about their legal guardians being in certain places with them. But this is an instance where, we let them waive their constitutional rights all alone in a police station. And these kids, they were subjected to sleep deprivation. As sleep deprivation has similar effects to being drunk, right? So after 16 hours without sleep, your cognitive ability is equivalent to a blood alcohol level of like 0.05. Uh, and it's applies a lot of psychological pressure, right? And imagine feeling so worn down, so hopeless that confessing something you didn't do seems like your only way out. That becomes the reality. And as we know from television and from various true crime documentaries, police are legally allowed to lie to you during an interrogation. So they can say they have evidence that they don't have. They can tell you that if you say XYZ, you can go home. It's tempting. It's very tempting, especially after hours and hours of interrogation. And the interrogators are also human and suffer from tunnel vision. So, tunnel vision is when interrogators become so convinced of a suspect's guilt that they ignore evidence to the contrary. And it becomes like wearing like guilt-colored glasses, right? So, the more a suspect proclaims their innocence, the more guilty they appear to a biased interrogator. And it's damned if you do, damned if you don't in that situation. And we don't have records of this. So imagine if we had a video of every minute of the Central Park Five interrogations. How could that have potentially altered the outcome of this case? Or would it not have changed the outcome of this case? Right. And then we have inadequate training on false confession. So many interrogators aren't trained to spot signs of a false confession. So only about 38% of law enforcement agencies train officers on the causes of false confessions, right? That is compared to the opposite end of the spectrum on officers who are trained to interrogate or officers who are trained to moving away from the case a little bit and talking about the unreliability of eyewitness testimony. So there are factors that affect eyewitness reliability, right? Such as stress, trauma during the event, the time elapsed between the event and the identification, and cross-racial identification issues, right? So when we talk about stress and trauma, I mean, picture yourself in an incredibly high stress situation. Maybe you're even fearing for your life. How well do you think you'd remember the details? Our brains tend to focus on survival, not memorizing faces. So the more traumatic the memory, the more traumatic an event is, the less reliable our memory of it tends to be. And there is time often between the occurrence of an event and the identification of the individual. So I don't know, try and remember what you had for lunch last Tuesday, right? Try and remember the last text that you sent without looking at your phone. Try and remember the last time you wore blue jeans, right? Now try to imagine a stranger's face from weeks ago or months ago after seeing them for a few seconds or a few minutes, right? Our memories are not like videos that we can replay perfectly. They're like stories that change each and every time we tell them. So the longer we wait, that the more that story can shift. And there's obvious issues with racial identification, pardon me. So thinking about what we discussed last week about technology that identifies individuals and how even technology had difficulty identifying Black and Asian individuals and often misidentified them. Imagine a human, right? So there is a psychological phenomenon called the cross-race effect, where people have a harder time recognizing the faces of other races. So think about if you grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood. Our brains work in very specific ways, right? And in a courtroom where you are being asked to give an eyewitness testimony, it can be devastating, right? And eyewitnesses are suggestible, right? So we see the impact of leading questions and lineup procedures. Sorry. So confirmation bias also exists in witness interviews. So talking about leading questions, imagine you're a witness and the police ask, did you see the red car speeding away? And suddenly you're not actually sure if you saw a red car or if your brain kind of filled in that detail, right? And when you look at police lineups, if you're asked to pick out a suspect and you know the culprit is supposed to be there, you might feel pressured to choose someone even if you're not sure. So it's like being asked to pick the criminal in the game of Guess Who when you're being told the answer is definitely on the board. So, and then we look at confirmation bias in witness interviews. Um, you notice when, you buy a new car, you suddenly see that model everywhere. Confirmation bias. In witness interviews, once someone has a suspect in mind, their brain starts looking for details to work around confirming it, right? Once you think you know how like the trick works, your brain starts seeing evidence to support your theory, even if it's not really there. And unfortunately, there's an over reliance on eyewitness testimony in court. So jury perception of eyewitness credibility is really high. So studies show that juries tend to believe eyewitnesses even when their testimony is contradicted by hard evidence. So it's like we're wired to trust a confident person saying, I saw it with my own eyes over facts and figures. So imagine you're on a jury. Who would you believe more? A DNA expert talking about the probabilities or the statistics, or a tearful witness pointing at the defendant and saying, that's him. Our emotions, in this instance, data shows often overrule our logic. So there's also a need for testimony, for expert testimony on eyewitness reliability, right? So a lot of courts don't allow experts to testify about the problems with eyewitness evidence. So it's like having a trial about a complex medical issue, but not allowing doctors to explain the science. Food for thought, right? We let experts testify about lie detector tests, which are not even admissible as evidence. But when it comes to the reliability of eyewitnesses, we don't allow experts to testify to the issues with eyewitness testimony, right? There is power in confidence in eyewitness testimony. So studies show that the confidence of an eyewitness has almost no correlation with its accuracy, right? And it's like a game of show where the most confident contestant isn't necessarily the one with the right answer. So imagine a witness who says, I am 100% certain it's this guy, right? It sounds convincing. It sounds like, absolutely, yeah, we got you. But their confidence may come from repeated retellings or suggestive questionings, but not actual accuracy, right? And it becomes like a game of telephone where the last person's absolutely certain they got the message right. And we also see the impact of weapons focus. So when a witness focuses so much on a weapon that they fail to notice important details, right? Think about it. If someone's pointing a gun at you, you're looking at their face or at the barrel of the gun. Our brains, again, prioritize survival. So you're looking at the immediate threat, often at the expense of other details. And there's the influence of post-event information. So your memory of an event can be altered by information you receive after the fact. So imagine you are on the street, you witness a crime, then you later read a news article about it that gets some details wrong. And your brain might unconsciously incorporate those errors into your memory. The problem also with sequential versus simultaneous lineups. So you are shown photos of potential suspects at a crime. You might be tempted to pick the person who looks most like the perpetrator, even if they're not the one. On the flip side, showing all the photos at once, it can lead to relative judgment. So picking the person who looks most like the perpetrator compared to the others, rather than making an absolute identification, it's a mess, right? And then there is the physiological role of stress hormones and memory formation. Now, high levels of stress hormones can actually impair memory formation. It's like, how to describe it? It's like you're writing on a whiteboard and someone's like erasing behind you, right? And look back on your life, think about your most stressful moments. How clear are those memories? Our brains are fantastic at remembering that something stressful happened, but not necessarily great at recalling the details. All right. So there are various issues with eyewitness testimony that have the potential to lead to miscarriage of justice and eventually to a wrongful conviction. So we talked a bit about issues of race in the criminal legal system. We talked a bit about flaws in interrogation techniques, especially the flaws in the interrogation techniques that were utilized in the Central Park Five case. We talked about the unreliability of eyewitness testimony. Now we want to talk a bit about the sensationalism in crime reporting, and specifically in the crime reporting that occurred on this case. So again, remember how the media portrayed the Central Park Five. Words like wolf pack, like wildling were thrown around, and it was almost like they were writing, I don't know, a horror movie script rather than neutrally portraying the news. So term wildling wasn't even like a real thing. It was a misheard word that the media ran with, and it ended up creating this image of feral teens terrorizing the city. And it led to a lot of pressure on law enforcement to solve high profile cases really quickly. So, picture not to give the detectives or the interrogators or anyone who screwed up on this case any leeway, but picture being a detective on this case, right? The media is breathing down your neck, the public is demanding answers, and you're feeling heat from your boss. It is not, it is not an easy situation to be in by any extent. Now, there was also political exploitation, right? So Donald Trump had a full page ad calling for the death penalty, right? He spent $85,000 to basically call for the lynching of five teenage boys, right? And imagine being one of those kids and seeing a powerful businessman calling for your death in the newspaper. And it's like having a bounty put on your head, right? And there was long-term consequences on public policy and on sentencing because of this case. So the ad didn't just affect the Central Park Five case, it helped fuel the tough on crime policies that led to mass incarceration. So the tough on crime policies that are still affecting us today, it has altered the collateral consequences of it are still being reckoned with to this day. And media and public portrayals today are even more astounding, right? So there's a rapid spread of misinformation today, and there are so many challenges in ensuring fair trials in the digital age. So imagine if the Central Park Five case happened today in the age of Twitter and Facebook, that information would spread like rapid fire, right? And we make jokes about like armchair detectives or digital detectives or whatever. In cases like this, sleuths could do real damage, right? So pictures trying to select an impartial jury today for a case like the Central Park Five, we already had massive issues trying to select unbiased jurors in that instance. Imagine today with everyone's opinions plastered all over social media. It is, again, a specific kind of irony. We have more access to information more than ever, but that can make it harder to get a fair trial, right? And race played a huge role in the media's narrative of this case specifically. And the way the media portrayed these young men, it tapped into like age-old stereotypes about young Black and brown men. And it's like they dusted off 1950s stereotypes about Black men, and you know, but it was 1989. At the flip side of the pros of media, or the pros of the digital age, if you will, if you fast forward to 2012, we get the Central Park Five documentary, and suddenly the narrative starts to shift, right? And you think about how many people learned the truth about this case through that documentary, and the Netflix series When They See Us. It's like the media finally got a chance to undo some of the damage that it had done decades earlier. But if you go back to 1989 in the echo chamber, if you read one newspaper's take on the case, chances you'd hear the same story echoed on TV and radio later. And imagine that echo chamber today with today's social media algorithms. You would be seeing the same narrative reinforced over and over and over again. And this has a lasting impact on the wrongly accused and the wrongly convicted. So these five men, these five boys then had their names and faces plastered all over the news, and they were depicted as violent criminals. Even after their exoneration, that stain doesn't just wash away, right? Think about trying to get a job with Central Park Five attached to your name. Google doesn't forget, and neither do a lot of people, right? And the media in this essence, in this situation, has responsibilities and ethics, right? Like, what if the media had been more skeptical? What if the media had been more careful, right? Maybe we wouldn't be talking about this case as a miscarriage of justice. Imagine that there was a rule that for every sensational like crime headline, there had to be an equally prominent story about wrongful convictions or systematic bias. It's not going to sell as many papers. It's not going to sell as like get as many clicks, right? But it may lead to a more informed public. No? Now, I want to talk a bit about the prosecutorial misconduct and overreach that happened in this case. So, some of the issues that we saw was withholding of exculpatory evidence, the overcharging to force plea bargain, resistance to admitting errors post conviction. We saw lack of accountability for prosecutorial misconduct. We saw tunnel vision and confirmation bias, and we saw them giving in to pressure to secure convictions, as well as exploiting the defendant's vulnerabilities and this long-term impact on public trust in the justice system. So starting with withholding of exculpatory evidence. So exculpatory evidence in the simplest way possible, right, is evidence that could lead to an innocent or a non-conviction charge for a person, or lack of charge for a person, right? So it's evidence that is in favor of the defendant. And imagine getting like playing a game of poker, and your opponent gets to see all the cards, but you only see half of yours, right? In this instance, the prosecutors knew that none of the DNA evidence found at the crime scene matched any of the accused five teenagers, but they didn't share that with the court. If you're a prosecutor sitting on evidence that might prove a person's innocence and you don't share it, what does that mean? Right? And we saw overcharging to force plea bargains. We see this very often in the criminal legal system, unfortunately, right? But picture this. You're a terrified teenager, you're facing a mountain of charges that could put you away for life, and suddenly a plea deal for a much shorter sentence is provided to you, and that looks really good, right? Even if you're innocent, because the potential, the counterfactual in that instance is life sentence, right? And that's the trap that the Central Park Five fell into. Four of the five teenagers were facing up to 30 years in prison, right? It makes sense that some of them considered these plea bargains. It They were between a rock and a hard place, right? And everything was stacked against them. fast forward to 2002, right? We get evidence, DNA evidence that proves that someone else committed the crime. And you'd think in that instance that the prosecutors would be falling over themselves to right this wrong. Wrong. Even after Matthias Reyes confessed and his DNA matched, some prosecutors still insisted that the five were somehow involved. And thinking about the prosecutors that worked on this case, admitting they were wrong meant admitting that they ruined the lives of five innocent people. There was a deep lack of accountability for prosecutorial misconduct. So there was a ton of misconduct that happened in this case, but zero prosecutors faced any serious consequences, right? And imagine if you worked at any other job, right? Imagine you worked at a job and you made a mistake that ruined someone's life. And the worst thing you got, the worst consequence you got was, you know, a slap on the wrist. And that's pretty much what happened here. The lead prosecutor in this case, Linda Fairstein, she went on to become a successful crime novelist, which is again ironic. But yeah, we saw tunnel vision and confirmation bias in this case and how it manifested. One of the prosecutors decided that the five were guilty, and they saw everything through that lens of guilt. And any evidence that didn't fit their theory was ignored or explained away. So the prosecutors interpreted the lack of physical evidence linking the five to the crime. Instead of seeing that as a red flag, they spun a theory about a sixth unidentified attacker. So there was obviously, as we said when we were talking about the media, there was a lot of pressure to secure a conviction in this instance. So again, there is enormous pressure to get a conviction. And this case was all over the news. And the prosecutors were under immense pressure to solve it at the expense of five teenage boys whose vulnerabilities were ultimately exploited. So the youngest was 14 years old, and they were being interrogated without lawyers and without parents present. The prosecutors took advantage of their youth and they took advantage of their fear and their lack of legal knowledge, right? And used all of that against them. And this ultimately had a deep impact on public trust in the justice system. So if prosecutors can do this and face no consequences, what else could they be doing, right? So the Central Park Five case didn't just harm five individuals, didn't just completely alter the lives of these five boys who are now men and alter the lives of their families. It damaged the public's trust in the justice system. Now, we already talked a bit about the role of or the impact of inadequate legal representation, specifically the role of overworked public defenders in this case, right? But we also want to think about the disparity in resources between prosecution and defense, as well as the lack of specialized training for juvenile cases and the impact of case outcomes and plea bargains. And as well as kind of some of the issues that manifested specifically in this case between client defendant communication, right? And how difficult it really can be to challenge prosecutorial narratives about what occurred, as well as the impact of the media and the media pressure on the defense and some of the long-term consequences of inadequate representation. So as we said, we already talked a bit about how overworked public defenders are. Think about that in 1989, right? So there is also a huge disparity in resources between prosecution and defense. Picture yourself, you're in a boxing match and one fighter has like a top of the line gym, team of trainers, nutritionists, unlimited practice time, and the other one has a jump rope and 5 minutes to warm up, right? So the prosecution has a whole team of investigators, a crime scene analysts, expert witnesses. The defense, not so much, right? So what if the playing field had been level, in this instance? What if the defense had the resources to properly investigate the crime scene, to analyze the DNA evidence, to bring in experts to challenge the coerced confessions? The outcome might have been very different in the Central Park Five case. And I'm not blaming the defense here, right? I'm trying to shed light on some of the systematic issues that exist when we're comparing the resources that the prosecution has versus the defense. And there's also a deep lack of specialized training for juvenile cases. So defending a juvenile in a high profile case like this one is not the same as defending an adult, right? And many lawyers, so they lack the specialized training. And thinking about the unique challenges that the Central Park Five case raised, right? So coerced confessions from minors, complex juvenile law, media frenzy, without the necessary training, it's impossible, right? It's nearly impossible to solve. So imagine if these lawyers had been experts in juvenile psychology, if they had been able to explain to the jury how easily teens could be coerced into a false confession. Again, this could have altered the trajectory of this case for the Central Park Five. Now, again, we talked really briefly about how overworked, under-resourced that our defense attorneys can be, and how maybe out of their depth they can be. And in that instance, what starts to look appealing are plea bargains, right? 4 of the 5 teenagers, again, were facing up to 30 years in prison. And with inadequate representation, these numbers start to make even unfair plea bargains look good. How many innocent people pled guilty or plead guilty every year because their lawyers don't have the time, the resources to mount a proper defense, right? In the Central Park Five case, we saw this pressure in action. And we saw a lot of challenges in client communication, right? So imagine trying to explain complex legal concepts to scared teenagers and to their families, all while having to juggle a mountain of other cases. So for the lawyers defending the Central Park Five, clear communication was crucial but incredibly challenging. And the Central Park Five and their families, they were navigating a terrifying, deeply unfamiliar world. They needed lawyers who could be guides, who could be translators, who could be advocators. But in reality, they were overworked, they were under-resourced, and this level of support that they needed was impossible, and that they deserved was impossible. And there was such difficulty in challenging prosecution narratives. So the prosecution spun this compelling narrative about wildling teenagers, right? It spun this compelling narrative about this wolf pack that was terrorizing New York City, that was terrorizing Central Park. And challenging this narrative, it required time, it required resources and expertise that the defense often lacked. Think about how hard it is to change someone's mind once they believe something. Now, multiply that by an entire jury, plus public opinion, plus the media frenzy that was happening. So that's what the defense was up against, right? And often without the resources needed to effectively even begin countering the prosecution's story. And we saw the huge role of the media in this instance. Imagine trying to build a strategy, a defense strategy, while the media is whipping up a frenzy about your clients, while a businessman is taking out $85,000 to put in an ad calling for the death penalty, right? This intense media coverage put enormous pressure on the defense. Every move was scrutinized, every statement was analyzed, all movements were broadcasted live with instant commentary, and that doesn't exactly equal a careful, strategic plan, right? And there was long-term consequences to consider here. It didn't end with the verdict. As we said, it meant years of wrongful imprisonment. It meant lost opportunities. It meant trauma. It meant shattered lives. How different might the lives of these men be if they receive top-notch legal representation from the start? It's a painful, painful what if, right? And it highlights one of the crucial importance of quality defense attorneys, especially in high stakes cases like this. And I think I'm going to stop here for today. I've been talking long enough. And we'll kind of pick up on this thread talking about the personal impact on the exonerated, talking about psychological trauma and PTSD very briefly before we talk about some of the legal and policy changes that could be potentially used to address some of the issues here today. And yeah, thanks for listening, guys.